Hello there. If you're a beginner Final Fantasy XIV player, or someone that just wants to experiment by trying a new role, you might be wondering which of the tanks available you should play. In this video I'll be comparing the options, and I'll give you a breakdown of the abilities to help you pick. While Endwalker had a more rocky than usual start in terms of balancing compared to previous expansions, things have pretty much evened out by now. All tanks are viable, and optimization beyond that is only important if you compete at the high end of the high-end raiders. You know, the tippity top of sweatiness. For us mere mortals, it's way more important to have a job that we enjoy and understand. Because more than anything else, the damage you deal depends on how well you can press your buttons. Changing from a comfort pick to a job you are unfamiliar with, because it's statistically a few % better, is a terrible idea. Especially if you come from a game like WoW, you might be used to particular classes just not being viable for entire expansions. This is not the case in Final Fantasy XIV, as all jobs are pretty much looked after. With that out of the way, a few weeks ago I ran a poll where I asked you which one your favorite tank was. And a whopping 48% of you said that you like Warrior the most. If you look at player numbers in the current raid tier, we can see that Warrior is indeed the most played tank right now. Warrior is Final Fantasy XIV's two-handed axe guy. There's a bit of a stereotype for them being a bit simple. If your healer makes monkey noises when talking to you, that's why. Warrior uses basic combo abilities to gain a resource called Beast Gauge. This Beast Gauge can be spent on heavy hitting abilities, one being single target and one being AoE. Once every minute, Warrior gets to use these abilities for free, allowing them to deal heavy damage for a short period of time. There are only a few off GCD abilities to be found, meaning Warrior is a relatively quiet job. There's not many buttons to press, the rotation is straightforward, and there's really not much you can mess up. Defensively, Warrior has solid, easy to understand abilities with a particular focus on self-healing. Looking at the numbers here, we can see that the other tanks aren't even close in competition. The on-demand self-healing gives Warrior a reactive playstyle that is beginner friendly, because unlike other tanks, they can shrug off damage after it's already done, meaning they're able to miss mitigating a few abilities without making their healers cry. When comparing our DPS ranks of all the tanks, we can see that Warrior's minimum and maximum rank are closest together out of all the tanks. What this would suggest to me is that Warrior has a low skill floor and a low skill ceiling, meaning it's hard to mess up and also easy to master in comparison to other tanks. More experienced players may feel limited by this job. In dungeons, Warrior is extremely strong right now. This is due to the self-healing provided by the ability Bloodwetting, which restores more HP the more enemies you hit with your weapon skills. During big dungeon pulls, this will effectively restore full HP bar every 30 seconds. The healing scaling with the number of enemies is key here because this is not something other tanks have. Their ability to heal themselves makes it so warriors don't rely on the actual healer to do that job. In duty roulettes, that's a good thing because you never know who you'll get queued with. Being able to do content independently from how your party is performing is a huge benefit of the job, and one of the main reasons why it's so well liked in my opinion. All tanks have an ability that makes them invulnerable or close to it for a few seconds. Warrior's invulnerability is called Holmgang. This tethers the warrior to a target, halting its movement and making it so the warrior's HP can't be reduced below 1 by regular abilities. As for the leveling process, Warrior is a solid option. However, it only starts feeling like a complete job at level 70 when you unlock Inner Release. This doesn't stop it from being a great first tank to play for beginners, as you really won't know what you're missing out on until you unlock it. The next tank on this list is Dark Knight, the job that scored lowest on my poll. The overall number of passes we can get from online data would suggest that it's the least played tank, but not by a wide margin. Dark Knight uses a two-handed sword and has a great overall theme to it. From job-specific story, the unique armors available, to the idea behind some of the abilities. A lot of people will pick Dark Knight just because it's badass. At its core, Dark Knight works in a similar way to Warrior. Using basic abilities charges your blood gauge, and this can be spent on heavy hitting, single target and AoE abilities. Just like Warrior, Dark Knight also gets to use these for free every minute or so. In comparison, however, Dark Knight has a lot of extra global cooldowns that have to be used while executing its rotation. and an additional resource to track. Dark Knight uses MP for two abilities called Flood and Edge of Shadow, which apply a damage buff called Dark Sight that has to be maintained at all times. Dark Knight's opener is quite busy due to all the extra cooldowns, but after that it becomes easy to execute. Looking at current damage numbers, we can see that all this button mashing is getting Dark Knight the highest damage out of all the tanks right now. Defensively, the job is looking quite a bit weaker than the others in Endwalker. Dark Knight has access to one of the most controversial defensive abilities in the game. Everyone I've talked to either loves or hates it. The Blackest Night is a large barrier applied either to the Dark Knight themselves or a party member. If it gets absorbed completely, Dark Knight gets to use Flood or Edge of Shadow for free, dealing damage and applying the buff Dark Sight. The ability is on a short 15-second cooldown, but it uses the same amount of MP as the equivalent damaging abilities. This creates an interesting problem because ideally Dark Knights want to use the Blackest Night on cooldown, always letting the barrier get absorbed to provide both protection and also receive a free cast of the damaging abilities. However, in situations where the ability can't be completely used up reliably, especially high-end players will get frustrated because it can mess up your opener rotations or reduce your overall damage.
The usability of this is ass. It being tied to your damage is miserable. It's just a pile of shit.
Dark Knight is the only job that has to balance mitigation and damage in that way, and it's an interesting dynamic. But I understand that it's definitely not for everyone. Other than that, Dark Knight suffers from a general lack of additional mitigation in comparison to some of the other tanks in the game right now. Two of the mitigation abilities apply only to magic damage, and there's a relative lack of self-healing. This makes the job one of the weakest defensively. Almost all of Dark Knight's mitigation relies on excellent Blackest Night usage. In endgame trials, Dark Knight surprisingly shines. In the recent Savage raid tier proc, Dark Knight was extremely popular as an off-tank, as high-end raiders value damage over most other things. In addition to that, the magic damage mitigation can be situationally useful for certain fights in particular. Dark Knight's invulnerability is called the Living Dead. When reaching 0 HP with Living Dead enabled, Dark Knights will receive a debuff called Walking Dead. This stops them from dying, but if they're not healed to 100% of their max HP, they will die once the timer runs out. This can be frustrating for the Dark Knight themselves to deal with, because there's no good way of applying self-healing. Instead, they'll have to rely on the healer for a clutch save. The barrier healers Scholar and Sage can struggle with this immensely, as big heals are locked behind unique resources and not always readily available. The overall dislike for the job in Endwalker can be explained by the lack of changes since the last expansion, compared to what the other tanks received. Dark Knight still plays mostly the same, outside of a few extra cooldowns to be used, making it even busier and spammier than before. Many players felt that bigger changes were needed and Dark Knight was left out. Personally, I think that the job feels bad to level, but it's a fantastic off-tank for max level trials and raids, although somewhat lacking in dungeons. Gunbreaker is the next job we're going to look at. It's very popular in endgame content with a healthy player base. The job uses the iconic Gunblade, and it's more fast-paced than other tank options, which translates into good damage, only inferior to Dark Knight at the moment. Gunbreaker focuses on heavy-hitting weaving windows, forcing the player to use a large amount of abilities consistently and to keep track of much more than the other tanks. The job uses a resource called Cartridge, which is shown in the powder gauge. This can be used on certain abilities, which ideally align with the burst window. Its fast pace makes tanking a lot more difficult. Moving bosses around while keeping up with the relatively demanding Gunbreaker rotation can be a real challenge, especially for beginners. Because the job requires a lot of double weaving, it's not really suitable for players with bad connections either, as not being able to reliably double weave significantly lowers the overall damage output, and through that one of the prime reasons for picking this job. Defensively, Gunbreaker has an extremely strong kit. Aside from regular mitigation abilities, it gets to use Heart of Corundum, which not only provides significant mitigation, but also healing. The challenging part here is that the ability only lasts for a short window, and fitting it into Gunbreaker's already busy rotation can be tricky if you don't want to clip abilities. More than any other tank job, Gunbreaker has to look ahead and plan out the fight to get the most of its abilities. using mitigation well before tank busters even show up, to be able to continue damage windows consistently. The combination of good damage and good mitigation makes Gunbreaker a popular option for high-end raiders in particular, allowing for decent skill expression that other tanks can lack at times. The combination of Gunbreaker Dark Knight was also the most popular during the last race for World First due to its high damage and raid-wide mitigation. Gunbreaker's invulnerability is super bolide. This reduces the tank's HP to 1, but stops them from taking lethal damage for the duration of the ability. It's a bit of a meme in the community, as many new Gunbreakers tend to fat finger the ability, giving the healers a hard attack. Personally, I would only recommend this job for more experienced players, or those looking for a real challenge, as playing it well consistently will require a lot more practice than other tanks. You'll also be pressing what feels like twice the buttons of other tanks for basically the same amount of damage. Paladin is the last job on this list. This is your true sword and board tank, most closely resembling what many people consider a classic tank, at least in appearance. The job had a rocky start, at least with high-end raiders, because of its comparatively low damage output. This got fixed in a recent patch, which now sees Paladin compete very closely with Warrior. The job's main rotation is fairly simple, and it revolves around maintaining a damage buff and using relatively few off GCDs on cooldown. What's unique in comparison to other tanks is the damage window, which has the Paladin casting Holy Spirit or Holy Circle, a ranged ability, multiple times. This can feel strange at first, but it works well with the job's identity as kind of a melee caster tank, not unlike Paladins we're already used to from games like World of Warcraft. It can be useful during movement and can help the Paladin easily position bosses without the risk of losing uptime due to missing GCDs. Defensively, Paladin uses Holy Sheltron regularly to block incoming attacks and provide a steady stream of healing. This ability, in combination with a few others, is tied to the unique resource called Oath Gauge. In comparison to other tanks, Paladin stays relatively healthy all the way through, relying on mitigation rather than burst self-healing. It has a large amount of party-wide mitigation with Passage of Arms, Intervention, Divine Veil, and Cover. This utility can be situationally useful, but it shouldn't be the primary reason for picking Paladin. Utility just isn't valued as highly as it used to be, because a lot of the fights are fairly streamlined now. Most of the time it just comes down to whether or not your party can do the mechanics, and the utility available to Paladin will rarely, if ever, be enough to single-handedly salvage runs. In addition to this, Paladin has access to Clemency, a single target heal that is on a global cooldown. This has a good potency and can often help your party in clutch situations, but it comes at the cost of the Paladin's own damage potency. Particularly in low-level dungeons and trials, Paladins can tank bosses and heal themselves easily even after both healers die. This makes it a good job for duty roulettes. The invulnerability is called Hallowed Ground. This makes the Paladin impervious to most attacks. Many people consider this the best invulnerability in the game, as it can be used outside of clutch situations where you're approaching 1 HP. However, the ability is on a long cooldown and you won't get to use it as often as other tanks. Difficulty-wise, Paladin is pretty much middle of the pack. It's not necessarily busy in its rotation, but it has access to a large amount of utility, and because of that it suffers from some defensive button bloat. There's just a lot of buttons on the hotbar, more than any other tank. And for a beginner it can be hard knowing which one of the utility options is actually any use. I don't think I've seen a single sprout use cover in any meaningful way in any of my duties up until now. So getting the most value out of Paladin requires some more practice than Warrior, but it's definitely not as intensive as the likes of Gunbreaker. To wrap this up, here's who I would recommend each of the tanks to. Keep in mind that if you simply enjoy the playstyle of one of them in particular, you shouldn't hesitate to give it a try. These are just recommendations based on my experience, and a lot of the downsides that I mentioned you will only really have to worry about if you plan on competing in really high-end content. Warrior is, in my opinion, the best tank for beginners, due to its easy rotation and intuitive abilities. Its low skill floor allows inexperienced players to focus on tanking mechanics rather than ability usage. Dark Knight is a good option for late game raiding and trials, mostly as an off tank. Even though many players dislike the job right now, it's generally well liked by parties. You won't have any trouble getting in anywhere. Gunbreaker is for players looking for a challenge. The solid defensive options in comparison to Dark Knight make up for the high skill ceiling, making Gunbreaker a good choice for all kinds of content. Paladin is kind of between all of the above. Steady mitigation combined with party utility make the job feel more supportive than other tanks. It's great for players who want to support their party in more ways than just by tanking the boss. However, you'll have to get used to a lot of button bloat, and you really have to read all of your abilities to play Paladin to the maximum of its ability. That's all I have for now, and if this video helped you out picking a tank to play, please leave a like down below as it helps me greatly. For now, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.